Well, hello. Today is the last Sunday before Christmas. And today we light the love candle, the last violet candle. So you may light all 3 violet candles and the pink candle today. Christmas is coming close. And so is the end of our story with Tabitha. Tabitha stared in disbelief. The man who had saved her was a woman and a cook. How could she overpower a thief like the butcher? "You're a woman!" Tabitha gasped. "Of course I am," the cook said as she pulled the cloak over her head. Zechariah took his off as well, and they hung the 2 garments on the line from which they had borrowed them. "Listen, Tabitha, just because you're a girl doesn't mean you're not as good as a boy." "That's what I've been saying," Tabitha cried. Zechariah shushed her and looked around nervously. "Come, we must leave this place before the rats come out." "And we must hurry to save your father," the cook said. They walked quickly up the side street then, with Zechariah holding tightly to Tabitha's tunic. "But who are you? And how do you know my name?" "Forgive me," Zechariah said as they scurried up the street. "I should have introduced you. Tabitha, this is Naomi, a friend I met this very night. She's the head cook for King Herod, and works in the palace." Zechariah pointed to the palace, towering overhead on top of the hill. "I saw you when you came into the butcher shop," Tabitha said. "Yes, and I saw you," Naomi answered, "but I had to pretend I was uninterested. I am not afraid of any man, but could not have rescued you from 2. The 3 turned onto the main street that ran toward the base of the hill. "So, how did you find Zechariah?" Tabitha asked. "After I left the butcher shop, I hid in the shadows to wait for Jehovah to provide a way to help you. After Zechariah left the shop, I pulled him aside, and together we made this plan. I knew those men would try to sell you to a Roman named Gaius. He's in town looking for slaves." "Yes," Tabitha shouted, "that is the name I heard." "So we borrowed the cloaks to hide our identities," Zechariah picked up the story, "and used surprise to our favor in rescuing you." Tabitha turned to Naomi and asked, "What of my father?" "He is well," Naomi said, "but he won't be for long. He is to go before Herod and Coponius this very night, following the feast being prepared even now." "Then we truly must hurry," Tabitha said. But then she stopped with a gasp and looked at Zechariah. "The scrolls!" she cried. "Your servant has not returned with my father's proof of citizenship." "Fear not, child," Zechariah said. "I shall wait here and bring it the moment he arrives." "But what if he doesn't?" Tabitha asked. Zechariah dropped to one knee and looked Tabitha in the eyes. "You must trust God," he said. "There are many things in this life we cannot control. You must have faith that God will take care of you and your father, either in this life or the next." Tabitha nodded slowly, although she still felt fear. "I will try," she said. "Come now," Naomi said, pulling Tabitha along. You will pose as one of my child's servants, but pray that we are not caught, or it will be the death for both of us." Tabitha shuddered a little as they headed up the steep road to the palace. She looked back to see Zechariah waving goodbye and decided to believe that Jehovah really was still with her. At the top of the hill, Naomi led Tabitha around the side of the walled fortress. Tabitha gawked at the gold and marble pillars of the main entrance as they went by. but knew they would have to use the servants' entrance. As they walked along a narrow trail, a Jewish guard patrolling nearby eyed them suspiciously. Naomi went straight for a small door in the side of the wall where another Jewish guard stood post. "The cook Naomi and her helper girl returning from the village," Naomi reported to the guard. He looked Tabitha up and down, trying to remember if he'd ever seen the child before. Then he stepped aside and nodded toward the entrance. Naomi pushed the door open and stepped inside. Tabitha followed, trying not to look at the guard. She closed the door behind them, and Naomi let out a sigh of relief. "Safe thus far," she whispered, "but the real test will come later." Tabitha decided not to ask what the real test would be, nor did she have time. She was instantly struck by all the noise and commotion. They had entered the kitchen of the palace. Here servants were busy preparing the evening feast. No less than 30 women and men scurried around the room, carrying platters and pots and piles of dishes. Steam rose from vats of boiling vegetables. Smoke cuddled the searing chunks of deer meat over a fire, and round loaves of freshly baked bread filled baskets on a table in the middle of the room. Tabitha had never seen a place like this, and she memorized every cook and candle and carrot to tell her mother some day. "Father," Tabitha thought, remembering why she was here in the first place, "I've got to find Father and return him to Mother." Naomi went to the fire pit and sliced off a chunk of deer meat. She tasted it and then sprinkled some seasonings over all the portions. "A bit more coriander," she said. "Caponius likes it that way." She told one of her assistants to let the meat roast a short time more, then introduced Tabitha to a boy of about 12. "Simon, this is Tabitha. Instruct her well in how to serve the king." Then, in a whisper, she said to them both, "Her story is very much like your own." "Yes, Naomi," the boy said, then turned and greeted Tabitha. "May you always find joy in your work here," he said with a bow. "Thank you," Tabitha replied, "but I hope my work here only lasts this one night." The boy looked shocked at this, so Tabitha gave him a quick explanation. "Then you must have success in freeing your father," Simon said. "Now I must teach you what you must know." With that, the boy began explaining the rules. "Always keep your head down and your eyes on the floor. You must take off your sandals before entering the throne room. Never turn your back on the king. Walk backwards out of the room. Hold the serving dishes at arm's length in front of you." And on until Tabitha thought they had more rules here than they did in Qumran. Simon had just finished explaining the rules when Naomi announced it was time to serve. A dozen children lined up, and each was given a dish to carry. Holding them out in front of them with their heads down and sandals off, they all lined up, led by Simon. Tabitha stood at the end of the line and then followed it down a hallway. Simon made a left turn through an arched doorway, and when Tabitha reached the same place, she looked up and gasped. Our question after reading this is this: what would happen if Tabitha let her fear rule her life instead of trusting God? Do you think she would have been able to get away from Decha? Or walk by herself to Jericho? I don't think so. Now let's read part 2. Part 2 of the Holy Week, or the Christmas week readings. On the other side was a room of marble large enough to hold her father's entire caravan, with all its tents and animals. There were gold and marble statues all about. Draperies hung between the columns, and even a fountain on one side of the room. At the far end stood 2 thrones of solid marble, one larger and higher than the other. The floor of the throne room was covered with colorful Persian rugs, and on top of these was a circle of men lounging on pillows. It was such a magnificent sight that Tabitha almost forgot to keep her eyes down, but remembered when she saw one of the men in the circle scowling at her. As Simon had instructed, Tabitha set her tray of meat in front of 2 men, then walked backwards out of the room. She couldn't help stealing a glance, though, at the 2 on the far side of the circle. One was a Jew, she could tell, sitting on pillows larger and higher than most. His face was sunken and his skin gray, but he wore a crown of gold on his head and was covered with jewels and fine stitchery. Headed, she realized with a start. Next to him, on the highest and biggest pillows of all, sat a man in the uniform of a high Roman official. This must be the Roman investigator, Tabitha decided. Copius Corpulus Coponius, that was it. By the time Tabitha remembered the name, she was out in the hallway. She stood and turned to follow the rest of the children back to the kitchen. She did well, Simon reported to Naomi as the cook tested some quail meat. Then perhaps our plan will work, Naomi said, wiping quail grease from her lips. Nothing will work if my father's parchment does not arrive soon. Naomi thought a moment and then turned to the boy Simon. They huddled together, whispering for a moment. Then Simon said, Yes, Naomi, and left through a side door. What is Simon doing? Tabitha asked. A small errand, the cook answered, just in case. Naomi didn't say in case of what, and Tabitha didn't have time to ask, because just then the head servant in the throne room rang for the next course to be served. Tabitha followed the other children once more, minus Simon, and then again some time later for the third and final course. Once back in the kitchen, Naomi wiped her hands on a cloth and said, I fear the time of judgments has come. Tabitha turned pale and her knees weakened. Come, Naomi said, we shall watch from the hallway. Leading Tabitha back down the great halls, they peeked through the door the children had used to serve food. Tabitha saw that Herod was now seated on the lower of the 2 thrones at the far end of the room, and the Roman Coponius on the taller one. The other men who had shared the meal were standing along either side of the room and were talking and laughing as if this were some great party. Bring in the first of the prisoners, Herod roared, and a moment later Tabitha almost fainted as Roman soldiers pushed 3 men in irons through a side door. The 3 men were haggard and bloody, having obviously been beaten by their guards. Tabitha watched as they were thrown to the floor in front of Coponius, and was relieved to see that none of them were her father. A Roman soldier began reading charges against the men, using words Tabitha had never heard before. Words like sedition, treason, and rebellion. A few moments later, Coponius raised his jeweled staff high over his head, saying, I pronounce the sentence of death by crucifixion. He brought the staff down hard, the end of it making a loud thud on the marble. Instantly the 3 men were dragged away, and 2 more were brought in. King Herod, on his throne next to Coponius, sat giggling and clapping. He sounds like a girl, Tabitha thought. In pairs and threes, and some all by themselves, men and even some boys were brought before Coponius for judgment. In almost all cases the sentence was death. except a few boys who were sent off to work gold, copper, and salt mines for the rest of their lives. All right, you need to get off my lap. Okay. All this took quite some time, and Tabitha's heart raced faster and faster with each new death sentence. It stopped altogether when she saw her father brought in. Eliakim looked much older than he had just a few days before, his face drawn and weary. So, too, did Hasba and Uzziah. Irons connected by chains were on the wrists and ankles of the three, and they sounded a sad melody as the men trudged to a square of red marble in the front of thrones. Tabitha's uncle Uzziah had bruises on his face. Then Tabitha saw the Roman who had arrested her father, and she glared and gritted her teeth. "I charge these men with treason, sedition, thievery, and making false claims of citizenship," the centurion bellowed. Coponius looked bored by now, as if he just wanted to get this over with. "Read the evidence," he droned. Even the men along the sides of the room seemed to be losing interest in the trials. At first they had cheered each time a man was sentenced to death. Now there was only polite applause. "On a night 6 days hence," the centurion read, trying to make it sound dramatic, "your servant observed the prisoners attempting to make inconspicuous flight, hiding in their midst a girl disguised as a boy for some treasonous scheme against Rome. When confronted with their deception, the three attacked my squad, injuring 3 men with terrible bodily harm. Once subdued, the leader of the 3 made a claim of Roman citizenship, a claim he could not and has not verified to this day, and in fact has himself refuted by his own words and mannerisms, speaking often of the Jewish God as his Lord and Master." Coponius was now mildly interested, and he stared at Eliakim. "Have you any words?" he asked. Eliakim lifted his head, and Tabitha could see that it was painful for him to do so. "I have many words," he said, "words of truth, words of honor, words of faith, but I have no words which you will believe, or which you will act on, even if you did believe." Coponius stared again, surprised by the eloquence of the prisoner's speech. Wanting to be certain before pronouncing judgment, he asked Eliakim, "And what of this citizenship you claim? Why have you no proof?" At that, Tabitha looked back down the hallway behind her, hoping to see Zechariah approaching. Of course, he was not. "My citizenship is true," Eliakim said, his voice echoing off the walls of the great hall, "and I carry it with honor. It is a reward given me for service to Rome, and it is among my greatest possessions. My citizenship," he continued, "is as much a part of me as my heart, or my soul, or my Jewish heritage. It is with me in life, it will be with me in death. It is not something etched on a scrap of parchment." "So you have no proof?" Coponius scoffed. "The proof you seek, I do indeed have," Eliakim answered wearily. "But in your haste for justice, you will not be willing to wait for it." Coponius eyed Eliakim for a long time. Then he sighed and said, "The law is clear, and my duty written. I find you guilty of the charges, and I pronounce the sentence of death by crucifixion." Coponius raised his staff high over his head, but before he brought it down, and before she had even thought about it, Tabitha raced into the room and shouted, "No!" The Roman official held his staff in midair and stared at the intruder in shock. "Wait!" Tabitha cried. "I can prove he's innocent." Two guards grabbed Tabitha before she was halfway to the thrones. They stretched her arms out between them and started dragging her back the way she had come. "Hold!" Coponius shouted, and the guards stopped where they were. "Bring her forward. I will hear her plea." All this time, King Herod had sat on his throne amused at the three shepherds before him. Now he laughed heartily at the spectacle of a girl trying to testify. "Speak your words," Coponius said. "What is your proof?" "My proof is in the very words of your own soldier," Tabitha shouted, pulling one arm free from her guard and pointing at the centurion who had read the charges. Coponius's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and Herod giggled even louder. "Continue," the Roman said. "Did he not say that these men disguised me as a boy, and were smuggling me through the country for some evil deed against Rome?" At this, the centurion took a long look at Tabitha, finally recognizing her as the girl that had been with Eliakim. "The girl he spoke of was you?" Coponius asked in surprise. At the same time, Herod stopped laughing, and his eyes darted around the room, trying to figure out how the girl had sneaked into the palace. "Yes, that was me," Tabitha said in a strong voice, "and that is the fact that proves he made up the whole story." Coponius looked puzzled now and shook her head slowly. "I do not understand," he said. "Explain yourself." "Well," Tabitha said, trying to make her words sound as logical as those of her father, "if I am the girl they disguised as a boy, and if I were a terrible threat to Rome," she said, "then why did your soldier push me in the dirt and leave me behind? Why did he not arrest me with the others?" Coponius stared at Tabitha for a long moment, then turned his gaze slowly toward the centurion. "Yes, that is an excellent question," he said. "Why is this so?" he asked the soldier. The centurion turned pale and began to stutter. I said that the men had kidnapped the girl." "That's not what you said," Tabitha shouted. "You said hiding in their midst a girl disguised as a boy for some treasonous scheme against Rome." "She is correct," Coponius said. "I remember your words, so what is your defense?" The centurion stood, silent, his face growing more red by the moment as anger and hatred and fear all fought for control of his thinking. "I will deal with you in a moment, centurion," the Coponius said. Then he turned to Tabitha. "You proved your point well," he said. Tabitha felt the tension flow from her body, and she felt herself breathe for what seemed like the first time in a week. "The charges of treason and sedition are dropped." A grin wider than the Jordan River crossed Tabitha's face, and she could almost feel her father's arms around her. But a moment later her joy turned to terror as Coponius said, "However, the charge of striking a Roman soldier still stands, and on that charge I find you guilty." "No!" Tabitha screamed, and once again the guards held her back. Coponius raised his scepter high over his head. "I sentence you to death by execution." "Crucifixion," he said. But just before he brought the staff down, with the thud of finality, a scream cut through the air that made everyone in the throne room stop and stare. And that's the end of our readings for today. Consider, Tabitha was not able to change the sentence of death for her father. And sometimes we're not able to stop bad things from happening to people who don't deserve it, to people we love. Does that mean that God isn't with us anymore? Or that he doesn't care? What do you think? That's something to talk to God about, and with your family. As Christmas approaches, tomorrow we'll read part 3. Good night.